Everyone, and hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar, an introduction to resilience for trauma-informed professionals, specifically for mental health providers in forensic contexts. And this is being brought to you by the Center for Trauma Recovery and Juvenile Justice, which supports a framework for developing, adopting, implementing, and sustaining evidence-based trauma-informed services for youth in or at risk for involvement in the juvenile justice system, as well as their families. Just some housekeeping issues. As we go through the webinar, if you have questions or comments, please enter them into the Q&A function rather than the chat, and I'll try to address as many questions as I can at the end. Also, this webinar is being recorded, and all participants will receive a follow-up email telling you how to access the recording on the center's YouTube channel. And at the end, there will be a certificate of attendance that will be available for you to download. It's not associated with CE credits, but if it's of use to you to have that evidence that you attended this webinar, you can access that certificate at the end. I'm introducing myself today. I'm Patricia Carrig. I'm a professor of clinical psychology at the University of Utah and a faculty member of the Center for Trauma Recovery and Juvenile Justice. My research is focused on understanding the developmental processes that link childhood trauma exposure to adolescent justice involvement and to resilience. And through the CTRJJ, I've contributed to efforts to develop and disseminate evidence-based trauma-informed practices with a particular eye to protecting staff from the effects of exposure to secondary traumatic stress. And in very recent news, I have been asked to take on the role of editor-in-chief of the Journal of Child and Adolescent Trauma. So this next slide gives you an overview of what we're going to be talking about in this brief hour we have together today. We'll talk about defining secondary traumatic stress and how we might go beyond self-care to take a resilience-oriented perspective. And then I'll introduce you to some of the tools that are part of the curriculum I've developed called Resilience for Trauma-Informed Professionals. And along the way, we'll do a skill building exercise together. But I want to start by telling you a story about how I came to be interested in this topic. This was a few years back when, as part of my work with the Center for Trauma Recovery and Juvenile Justice, I was doing trauma trainings for staff in juvenile justice facilities. And at the end of one of those trainings with a group of probation officers down in Provo, Utah, a gentleman who'd been sitting quietly throughout raised his hand and said, "You've convinced me it's important that we know the youth we work with have experienced trauma, but I don't want to be the one to do that work." And I asked him, "Tell me more what you're thinking." And he said, "Because if a youth told me any of those horrible things had happened to them, I wouldn't know what to say." And I thought to myself, that makes perfect sense. You've been trained as a probation officer. You haven't received training in how to respond in helpful ways to a youth's trauma disclosures. And importantly, you also haven't received training in how to cope with the difficult thoughts and feelings that we have when we learn about other people's traumas. So I thought to myself that something more was needed, and I set out on a journey of discovery to learn all that I could about what we know about secondary traumatic stress and what helps in the aftermath of exposure. And I found some wonderful resources that I'll share with you today, but I also saw some gaps. And as I began talking more about this issue, more and more people in different professions came forward and said, this is relevant to us too, including mental health providers who said to me, it's assumed that we know how to handle this, but we haven't received training in this either. So, who in the juvenile justice system is exposed to others' traumas? It turns out we all are, from mental health providers to attorneys and judges, detention staff, and even researchers who study topics related to juvenile justice and trauma. The exposures can take different forms, but common themes that I heard about in the listening sessions that I've been conducting include reading trauma-filled case histories, gathering those histories, hearing trauma disclosures, viewing graphic evidence, interacting with distressed youth and family members, and listening to our colleagues talk about their cases. And importantly, for those who work in facilities, it goes beyond hearing stories about things that happened long in the past, but sensory inputs, sounds and smells and sights that tell us in a very immediate way that something bad has happened here. So, why should we be concerned about exposure to other people's traumas? Well, in fact, others' traumas have a real impact on us. As Tim Wires, the chief of probation in Stark County, said, you don't have to be shot to go through a shooting. And in fact, exposure to others' traumas is a potential source of trauma for us. Now, I think it's important to know that that wasn't always understood to be the case. The long-standing definition of what comprises trauma, sorry, my slides aren't advancing, in the diagnostic manual is exposure to actual or threatened death, injury, or sexual violence through directly experiencing ourselves, witnessing it in person, or learning the event has happened to a loved one. This we can term primary trauma. But it wasn't until the DSM was revised in DSM-5 that added to that definition was repeated or extreme exposure to the aversive details of somebody else's traumatic event. And the definition goes on to specifically name people who, through their line of work, need to be exposed repeatedly to these kinds of details. So that we can term secondary traumatic stress. So if this is the case, then addressing STS is not just something that we need to take care of when we go home at the end of the day. It's a professional competency for those whose work involves traumatized individuals or exposure to trauma-related material. So beyond personal self-care, the skills for recognizing, preventing, and responding to STS need to be tools in our own professional toolkits. However, even though I'm talking about STS in the context of a psychiatric diagnosis, having a reaction to others' traumas is not a sign of pathology. It's only human. PTSD and secondary traumatic stress come into play when those reactions cause us significant distress and interfere with our ability to function. After all, as Rachel Raymond puts it, expecting that we can be exposed to trauma-related information every day in our work lives without being affected is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to wade through water without getting wet. Before I go further, though, I want to talk about the different terms that get used in this literature. They're sometimes talked about as though they are quite distinct from one another, other times as though they're interchangeable. But what I think is that each of these constructs captures one facet of a multifaceted phenomenon. So one term is burnout, and this refers to feelings of emotional exhaustion, alienation, and ineffectiveness that can come about when we're doing work in which we feel powerless and unappreciated. And certainly burnout can come about in the context of working with trauma. But what's important to remember is that burnout is not specific to trauma. The person who flips burgers at Burger King can experience burnout if they feel unappreciated and powerless. Another term that's used is compassion fatigue. And this captures that sense of being emotionally spent by caring for others without being able to replenish our own reserves. We've gone to the well once too often. But this, in fact, is a problematic term, and I want to explain to you why I'm saying that. There is a wonderful animated film that Brene Brown developed to illustrate the difference between empathy and sympathy. And in this film, the little fox has climbed down into the well of despair. Other animals come by and offer sympathy. Hey, hope you feel better soon. Looks like a drag. But this empathetic bear comes down into the well and shares with the fox's feeling state. The fox appreciates this. The fox no longer feels so alone and feels more understood. But if you look at this image, you can see the dark clouds of despair hanging over both of their heads. And I wonder what's going to happen to that poor bear. So, with empathy is sharing in another person's feeling state. Compassion is actually something different. Compassion refers to seeing that another person is struggling or in need of help and wanting to assist them. So rather than climbing down into the well with somebody who's in despair, we throw them a lifeline and help to lift them up. And further, if we're doing this in the context of a mutually supportive environment, we're not having to do that alone. We all have one another's backs. So I think compassion fatigue is a misnomer, and a better term for this phenomenon is empathy fatigue, because that is what is fatiguing. Then yet another term that gets used is vicarious trauma. And this captures really well that change in our own inner experience that can come about when we have engaged empathically with a traumatized person. And one of the reasons why I think vicarious trauma is such a helpful construct to keep in mind is it's related to another one that has been more recently identified, termed moral injury. So if we dig a little deeper, moral injury has been defined by Brett Litz and his colleagues as perpetrating, failing to prevent, bearing witness to, or learning about acts that transgress our own moral beliefs and expectations. This was a construct that was first identified in military personnel who were coming back from service troubled by things that they had done or had seen. But it has been expanded to a wide range of different contexts, including healthcare providers during the pandemic. In my own lab, we've extended the construct to adolescents in the juvenile justice system and adolescents in gangs. And they have no difficulty identifying things that trouble them, that they have done on their own initiative, that they've done under duress, things they failed to do or witnessed. But of all the dimensions of moral injury, the one that we have found to be most impactful is betrayal, when a youth felt that they should have been able to turn to somebody for protection and care, and that person did something hurtful that they believe is wrong. So then we come to the last term, and it's the one that I've been using. In the formal sense, secondary traumatic stress refers to the presence of any of the symptoms of PTSD arising from indirect exposure, including intrusive thoughts and feelings, desire to avoid reminders, changes in our thoughts and feelings, and symptoms of hyperarousal. And because I think of STS as being on the extreme end of a continuum, I think it contains elements of the other concepts. And so that is the term that I've been using. Now, we know that another reason it's useful to think about these constructs is there also can be the opposite. So, just as there can be so called compassion fatigue or empathy fatigue, there's also compassion satisfaction, the positive feelings that we can get from doing work that we feel is meaningful and at which we're competent, and when we have positive relationships with our coworkers. By the same token, just as there's vicarious trauma, there's also the potential for vicarious resilience, the uplift that we get when we witness another person recover from trauma. And we know a bit from research about what the risk and protective factors are for secondary traumatic stress. An important one is working in an isolative work environment, whereas connection with coworkers is protective. The sheer volume of trauma exposure increases the risk, whereas support and debriefing in helpful ways, which we'll talk about in a bit, can be protective. Some research suggests that people who have high levels of empathy are more vulnerable, and yet compassion satisfaction can abate that risk. A very important one is having shame about having STS reactions. People can be very judgmental of themselves. I'm supposed to be a professional and not have these thoughts and feelings, whereas openness and acknowledgement can be protective. Coming into this work with our own history of adverse experiences and trauma can make us more vulnerable, but that's not absolute. Having achieved resolution and made meaning of those experiences has been found empirically to disconnect that link. And then the last thing on this table is not something we have empirical evidence for yet, but I am hoping to gather it because this is my hypothesis and my observation that going into this work feeling unprepared for what you might encounter, like that probation officer I described, I think increases the risk of the vulnerability to STS. Whereas knowing that we have the right tools in our toolkit that we can pull out when needed, I think in itself is going to be protective. So, what does secondary traumatic stress look like? Well, it depends on who you ask. And one of the resources I found that I really appreciated is a book by Laura Vandernoot Lipsky called Trauma Stewardship. And she makes the point that if we are going to be caregivers to those who've experienced trauma, we also need to be good caregivers or stewards of our own well being and our capacity to be helpful. So, in this book, one of the things I love about it is her use of humor because it allows us to look at hard things with some of the edges softened. And she got permission to reproduce a number of cartoons from the New Yorker. And so I asked for permission to use those as well. So let's take a look. What can STS look like? One form it can take is feelings of helplessness and low self-efficacy. And although I think this is a very funny cartoon, I'm going to take exception to it in a little bit. Another sign is that feeling that we can never do enough, that we're just howling at the moon. Another is that sense of hypervigilance, of always being on and barking at everything. Another is a loss of pleasure in life. A very big one that I see a lot is cynicism. Often people talk about identifying that they no longer have the sense of meaning in their work and optimism that led them to come into this work in the first place. On the other hand, for others, it takes the form of feeling trapped by their own indispensability, that they are the only ones who can put out this forest fire. As Ed mentioned, the cartoons use humor to let us look at some painful truths. And in the book, Vandernoot Lipsky accompanies the cartoons with some quotes from actual people. So here's an animal rescue worker who talks about it doesn't matter how many animals I save, I can only think of the ones that I've failed to save. And that feels like a personal failure. Here, a community organizer talks about just getting through the day and coming home and going round and round the dial. And that's all there is to life. Here, a domestic violence advocate talks about not being able to even take pleasure in looking at a friend's wedding pictures without the intrusive thought coming into her mind, I wonder when the domestic violence is going to start. And then here, an attorney says it's not just a feeling that I can't do enough. If I don't do it, people could die. I had mentioned there are symptoms of secondary traumatic stress that take physical forms, exhaustion, not sleeping or oversleeping, stress-related aches and pains, even getting sick more often if our immune system is suppressed. Some signs may be behavioral, increased substance use or other kinds of addictive behaviors, whether that's shopping or social media or workaholism, anger and irritability, socially isolating ourselves, and what Francoise Mathieu refers to as the silencing response, shutting other people down in ways that let them know I'm full up to here and I don't have anything more to give. The signs also may be psychological, emotional exhaustion, feelings of ineffectiveness and negative mood, the reduced empathy and cynicism and loss of pleasure in life we talked about, a change in worldview when moral injury comes into play, and any of the symptoms associated with PTSD, including dissociation. And here we also see some major individual differences, whereas some people report becoming overly sensitive and being unable to tolerate movies or TV shows or books that have scenes that are reminiscent of the traumas they're exposed to at work. Other people will report the opposite of feeling numbed and undersensitive. Other signs may be in the professional realm, that overburdened sense of responsibility and being always on, or the opposite of avoiding work, resenting the demands of the workday, difficulty making decisions, and overall difficulty separating our work from our personal lives. And although I'm talking about these as separate domains, of course, they tend to co-occur and interact with one another. I'd mentioned before that I have been performing listening sessions with different constituents of professionals in the juvenile justice system. And people have been very generous in sharing their thoughts and experiences with me regarding how they encounter secondary traumatic stress and how it affects them and their colleagues around them. What mental health providers and forensic contacts have told me was very rich. We could spend our entire hour talking about the things that they shared with me. People had very strong reactions to being in facilities and the sensory inputs, feeling itchy and antsy and irritated, taking their worry home with them, finding their thinking becoming more rigid, and having low distress tolerance. Something that was really unique to the experience that was shared to me by mental health providers was the huge emotional effort involved in not showing that I'm upset or scared or disturbed by what I'm hearing in sessions. People talked about physical symptoms such as tension in the jaw. And something else that I think mental health providers had insight into was realizing that they were commuting home in a daze, coming home and not remembering the trip because they had been dissociating. They also talked about the effects on their home life, that their family notices that they've changed, they're fatigued all the time, and also people reported having nightmares and having difficulty not thinking about the things that have happened to the youth they work with. Importantly, people talked about not being able to share this with family members because they didn't want to expose them as well. Other things that mental health providers talked about was how they see STS as related to turnover amongst staff, that it takes a toll on their personal lives, and that this is actually a form of avoidance. There was a lot of discussion, too, of what might be related to moral injury, of feeling a misalignment between people's work as therapists and the mission of the justice system at all. As one put it, it's like gaslighting. We're told mental health is important, and then people make it impossible for us to provide it. So this is really poignant, and I think points to the final comment that we're so vulnerable to STS, we're always overfilling someone else's cup. So I also asked people what helps, and what they shared included constantly identifying what I do and don't have control over, actively doing an SOS, which we can talk about more if people aren't familiar with that technique, noticing when I'm leaning forward too far, savoring the reward of reaching somebody who feels unreachable, refocusing together as a team. Someone even referred to this as a trauma bond. And then another put it really nicely, reminding myself that being resilient means having a boring life, that that's an okay thing to do. So is this news? Does nobody know about this? I know that the text on this slide is way too small, but I put all of these up here just as an illustration of how many articles and chapters I found when I went into the literature that talk about the impact of this work on mental health providers. So clearly, this is something that we know about. The question is, what can we do that helps? In fact, recently a court system in Australia was found liable for not protecting its staff from the negative effects of what they were terming vicarious trauma exposure. The argument was that there is a duty of care when employers expose employees to trauma as an inherent part of their work. So clearly, this is something that we want to take action on. And what can we do? When we turn to the literature, what we find is almost universally a recommendation to engage in self-care. Oops. Sorry, I've got a sticky button here. Try that again. So you see here a veritable sea of self-care recommendations. And there are also measures that we can use to do a self-check of are we engaging in self-care activities? Things like taking time off when it's granted, engaging in relaxing activities, getting exercise, and staying socially connected. And clearly, these are all things that would be helpful to bolstering our general well being. But are they sufficient to help us to overcome secondary traumatic stress? There's some reasons to think perhaps not. For one thing, what happens when busy and stressed people come home at the end of the day? What we utilize as self care aren't always the strategies that are going to be most helpful to us in the long run. In addition, though, there's some research to suggest that self care may be a limited approach. There was one study that I thought was really telling. And in this study, there were a group of trauma clinicians who participated in trainings focused on self care. And the first finding was that this did not increase the amount of time they spent in self care activities. Perhaps not surprising. We don't always do the things we know we are supposed to do. But what was really surprising to the researchers is that the amount of time people spent in self care was not associated with lower secondary traumatic stress. Well, why might this be so? I think one particular reason is that most suggested self care activities are things for us to do at home at the end of the day. So they're taking place long after trauma exposure and they're divorced from the workplace. I think instead, we need strategies we can use in the moment, in the here and now, and even proactive strategies we can use prior to exposures. And we also need strategies that we can use during the workday that are integrated with our workplace environment. Another potential limit of self care is that these strategies aren't always sensitive to cultural differences, which impact how we understand trauma, how we encode it, how we respond to traumatic events, as well as our beliefs about the processes that will lead to healing and what will be helpful for people in one culture may not be the things that are on these self-care inventories. So if we look for an alternative to self-care, one that I found appealing was to think about the concept of resilience. But what do I mean by that? When people first started studying resilience, they wrote about it as though there were some people who were just magically armor plated. They could walk through fire without being burned and were impervious to all adversity. But as we learned more about resilience, we found that that isn't true, that people who are resilient are still affected by their experiences. And that's just as well, because wearing a suit of armor would be hot and heavy and uncomfortable. I also don't think resilience is captured well by the idea of wearing a psychological hazmat suit that isolates us from the pathogens around us. As in fact, having emotions related to our work is not only human, our emotions are a valuable tool because they tell us when there's something that needs attending to. So I think of resilience as being successful adaptation in the face of challenges, while knowing that resilient people will be affected by their experiences. It's also not an all or nothing phenomenon. We can be resilient in some ways, even if we're struggling in others. And it's not just a matter of our own true grit. Resilience isn't a personality trait, although there are traits that might contribute to it. I prefer models that talk about resilience as being built of strengths and protective factors in multiple domains. So, as John Gritch and Sherry Hamby and their colleagues describe resilience, there's an emotional component, our capacity to be aware of our emotions and to regulate them. There's also a cognitive component, our ability to make sense of our experiences and integrate them with our own values. And then an interpersonal dimension, our capacity to be generative, compassionate toward others and ourselves, and to retain our sense of community. So, what would enable us to be resilient in the face of exposure to secondary traumatic stress? I would argue that just like exposure to primary traumas, secondary exposure dysregulates us physically, emotionally, cognitively, maybe even morally, and causes us to experience as though it's happening in the present, something that has happened in the past. So, if that's true, the strategies that will protect us will be those that reestablish our balance, ground us in the present, dispel unhelpful interpretations, and reconnect us to our strengths, sources of support, and values. So, with that resilience framework in mind, I developed this model and I've written about it in an article that describes the conceptual underpinnings. But I thought what would be more helpful as a way of introducing you to it is to walk you through how the tools come into play at each stage of our encounter with secondary traumatic stress. And I'll talk about each of these in more detail, but that includes prior to encounters, what can we do to be preventative? Then how can we support our own skills and resilience? And then during exposures, this is what I found was missing most from the other models that I studied. What can we do in the moment while we're being exposed to secondary traumatic stress? And then after exposure, what are the ways that we can monitor our well-being and recover our balance? So what I'm going to show you are some excerpts. Whoops. From the workbook that I created that accompanies the training. So first, if we think about prevention, are there ways that we could limit unnecessary exposures and protect others from spillover? So, for example, when youth come into facilities and staff are wanting to know whether trauma-informed services are necessary, one way that can be done is by gathering a trauma history, but that runs the risk of exposing the intake staff to stories about trauma. And maybe that isn't what we need to know. Maybe what we need to know is this youth having post-traumatic stress symptoms in the present? So one tool that we created to help with that gives youth an opportunity to talk about not what happened to them, but what are the things that are triggering for you, whether that's being left alone or feeling crowded with too many people around. Then how would people know that you have been triggered, whether that's becoming loud and angry or getting more and more quiet? And then what are the things that are helpful to you in the aftermath of being triggered, whether that is somebody coming into your space and talking with you or being allowed some time on your own? Importantly, though, we talk about ways in which we can protect one another. Debriefing in the aftermath of hearing a terrible story can be a very helpful thing to do. But one thing that we need to be mindful of is STS can be contagious. When we share a disturbing story, we might be passing on the secondary traumatic stress to someone else. So we talk about ways in which we can get support from our colleagues without sharing every graphic detail. And if we're on the receiving end of a debrief, how we can gently steer others from sharing too much information. And here we talk about a technique called limited impact debriefing that importantly sets the stage at the very beginning of a debrief by letting somebody know what we need to talk about and giving them a moment to decide this is a good time for me, or actually, this isn't something I could be helpful with at the moment. We also talk about what might keep us stuck in a trauma story, even after a debriefing. And here we spend time talking about the interpretations and the meaning that we make of the stories we hear. They're important because they impact the way we feel and think and interact with others, and they're also open to change. Then we talk about what we can do in the moment when we are hearing trauma disclosures or being exposed to trauma-related information. I took a page from that probation officer saying I wouldn't know what to say. And so we talk about that very concretely. What is helpful to say when you hear a disclosure and what wouldn't be helpful? We also talk about what for some people is a worst case scenario, the idea that somebody will become triggered and have a full-blown PTSD reaction. What is helpful to do in that situation? And in all of these tools, we're paying attention to individual differences, that what is an effective strategy for one person is not an effective strategy for another. So what we want to have in our toolkit is not a single-use tool, but rather a Swiss Army knife with a number of different techniques that we can share with people. And then we talk about what we can do that is helpful in the aftermath of exposure to secondary trauma. And one thing that we can do is to check on our own well-being. And there's some excellent tools to help us do that. For example, the Professional Quality of Life Scale is freely available online. There's a website that allows you to take the test and instantly get a score with a readout of your level of burnout, secondary traumatic stress, and compassion satisfaction. So this is great. But one potential limitation is that your signs of secondary traumatic stress might not be the ones that are listed on this measure. So an alternative that I want to introduce you to is called a dosimeter. This is your own personal early warning system. And what the dosimeter asks you to do is to sit down and think about, what are you like when you're in your green zone? When you're calm, when you're thinking clearly, and your sense of well-being is high. Then what are you like when you're in your yellow zone and you're just beginning to feel affected by the work you do? And then what are you like when you're in your red zone and secondary traumatic stress has gotten the better of you? And of course, it's so important to recognize our yellow zone so that we're not waiting too long to utilize the strategies that will allow us to return to green and to recover our balance. When people do this, I encourage them to think about, what are the signs that you experience when you're at work? And then what are the signs that you experience when you go home? Very often people will talk about being consummate professionals when they're at work, but it's when they go home and figuratively, if not literally, take off their uniform, that the effects can show themselves. And in this regard, when people complete their dosimeter, I often ask, who's the best source of information about this? And people's first thought is often, well, me, I know myself best. But I encourage people to think about the possibility that that may not necessarily always be true. Sometimes people make observations of ourselves that we're not aware of. For example, I had a colleague who told me, I can always tell when your work is beginning to affect you. And I said, oh, yeah, how? And she said, because you lose your sense of humor. And I wasn't aware of that. I just thought she wasn't being very funny anymore. But that was a very helpful observation. And if there is somebody that you feel comfortable partnering on this, that can have a couple of benefits. One, that they can give you a nudge if they're seeing signs that you're not aware of. And you can also act as accountability buddies for paying attention to your dosimeter. Excuse me. Excuse me. So the dosimeter becomes part of a larger toolkit that everyone develops that is uniquely reflective of their own reactions and the strategies that are helpful for them. So in addition to the dosimeter, we build in a weekly self-check. We pay attention to the strategies that will be helpful to us as we're anticipating exposure to others' traumas. And note the strategies that we find are effective for us in the moment, as well as after exposure. And then paying attention to the things that recharge our batteries and nurture our compassion satisfaction in a broader sense. We also don't forget about that Bober and Rieger study that people don't always use the strategies that they have learned. And so we talk about the things that get in the way, including thinking that self-care sounds selfish. When, as Sakma put it really powerfully, we have an obligation to our clients as well as ourselves, our colleagues, and our loved ones not to be damaged by the work we do. And as Robin Tenner put it, STS hurts you and it hurts your family. And we also talk about how going to a training like this or reading a workbook won't help unless we actually do the strategies. As Francois Mathieu talks about it, just reading about these strategies without doing them is like trying to fix a flat tire by reading your car's owner's manual. The other thing I want to emphasize, though, is we view addressing STS as a multi-pronged effort. Yes, there are things that we can make a personal investment to do, such as engaging in self-care and self-compassion. There are professional skills that we can learn individually, but a very important part of dealing with STS involves what organizations can do. And I think of, and this takes us back up to this stage of prior to exposure, creating a social ecology of mutual awareness and support around STS. So I think of organizational strategies as involving prevention whenever possible, monitoring of staff well-being. Hello, button. Oops. It likes to jump. And then responding to staff who've been affected, giving them access to resources and supports, including referrals for their own mental health. Because, as I mentioned, I take exception to this cartoon. Seeking therapy is, in fact, an act of high self-efficacy. And just as an example of this, I was working with a group that was tasked with reviewing critical incidents that had happened in a facility, and this sometimes meant looking at videos of very disturbing scenes. And so I created two new worksheets for the workbook on preparing to view this sort of material. And the first one was for organizations, what they can do to train and prepare and protect staff. And then the second one was for the individual staff members themselves. So on this next slide, I've provided some resources for creating STS-informed systems and organizations. There's also a slide in which I've provided some of the resources I have really appreciated on recovery and resilience from secondary trauma exposure. Some resources that are specific to justice contexts. And some resources I really appreciated on being an STS-informed therapist, as well as some resources on providing STS-informed clinical supervision. So I know these have flown by fast, but you'll be able to see all the slides again in the YouTube video. And at this point, I'd like to give folks a chance to ask questions or make comments. Excuse me. Please remember to put those in the Q&A function. And let me open that. And not seeing questions, but would be happy to answer any of them. Just to go further, as a reminder, as I mentioned, this has been recorded and will be up on the CTRJJ YouTube channel. If you participated today, you'll receive an alert when that is up. And there is one more of these sessions coming up that is specific to juvenile and family court judges in November. This next slide gives you a QR code that you can use to access the resources that are on the CTRJJ website, including a number of podcasts and other training materials. And then on this slide, here is the certificate that you may want to take a quick photo of the URL, but I'll leave it up here if people want to jot it down. And once you've accessed it, then you'll need to enter a password, which is providers in all caps. All right. I'm not seeing questions, but just give people another minute in case there are any questions or comments. Okay, I think we are done. Thank you all for your participation. And please feel free to contact me at the email address that was on the previous slide.